A very good afternoon to you, and I'm glad that you could find time to be with us this afternoon. The show is Diaspora Dispatches, where we get to discuss issues around Africa. Sometimes it's a news update, and other times, like today, we are going to have a topical discussion and over a matter that I saw on the news just the other day, a news item that I was reading to you, I think yesterday, and then I said perhaps it is an important moment that maybe I could take us through some history lesson here and get to learn more about the plight of these Ethiopian Jews that are finding a lot of difficulties in Israel. So thank you so much for joining me. My name is Miriam Ogotu. Now, the recent news item is Israel's education minister has apologized to Ethiopian Israeli schoolgirls whose teachers mocked them in a WhatsApp group on a school trip. The girls spotted the teachers messaging each other in a chat group they created called Black School Trip. One of the girls filmed the chat over a teacher's shoulder, then shared it on social media, calling the teachers a disgrace. And then the teachers involved were suspended, and the incident is being investigated. There are about 150,000 citizens of Ethiopian origin in Israel, the first of whom arrived in the sizable numbers in a series of top secret Mossad-led operations in the 1980s. The Ethiopian Jews' integration in Israel has been challenging, with the community suffering disproportionately high levels of unemployment and poverty, as well as discrimination, although the situation has shown signs of improvement in the recent years. And last Monday, teachers and pupils from a religious high school in Netivot, southern Israel, set off on a 3-day trip. Girls sitting behind one of the teachers saw her messaging in the group chat, which contained disparaging comments towards the Ethiopian Israeli pupils, and one of the pupils took a video of the chat in action without the teacher realizing. A pupil then shared a message to the perpetrators on social media, attaching pictures of their offensive messages. So let me just read through, and she attached these messages. Let me just read through her caption of that WhatsApp chat that was going on between her teachers during this trip. She said, "Good morning to all the educators," in quotes, "of this school," she wrote. "It saddens me as a member of the Ethiopian community to see the level you sank today. Instead of being our teachers and setting an example and making us feel like we are in our safest place, you did the exact opposite, opening a group called Black School Trip without even realizing that there were students behind you and mocking your students. I see the photos and I just don't believe that they come from our teachers. You are a disgrace. I'm ashamed that you are our teachers and that you're teaching the future generation." The teachers involved were suspended and have since apologized. The school's headmaster issued a statement speaking of his shock and devastation to miserable and extremely offensive comments from teachers about Ethiopian students who study in the school. Israeli Education Minister Yoav Kish also denounced the teachers, and this is what he said. "The incident will be dealt with severely with all the tools at our disposal. I'm sorry for the distress that was caused to the students. There will be zero tolerance for these sorts of incidents on my watch. The school management looks at these comments severely. There is no place for racist comments, and we will not allow for them to have a place for them in our school." So maybe some of us are wondering, what do you mean? Ethiopian Jews, how? Well, it's a long story, and it's just one of those stories that reads like a movie, and which one is considered as one of the biggest migration in the recent history, and that happened under the help of Mossad. I will not go too much into that story, because it's such a long, riveting story, but I'll try to do my best to make us understand how the Ethiopian Jews found themselves in Israel. Now, the story of the immigration and absorption of Ethiopian Jews in Israel epitomizes the best and the worst of Israeli society. True to its Zionist dream of being a heaven for Jews, the Jewish state embarked on risky and expensive rescue operations in the 1980s and the 1990s. This brought tens of thousands of Jews from the remote parts of Ethiopia who had suffered from religious persecution, famine, and civil wars. Yet, when they arrived in Israel, these distinctive people faced appalling discrimination, racism, and lack of empathy from their hardships in Ethiopia and during their journey to Israel. Moreover, this was exacerbated by a mixture of bureaucratic insensitivity and incompetence and characteristic violence seen recently that has been witnessed in Israel by members of the Ethiopian community in Israel was a direct result of years of accumulated frustration against the state and especially the police, the unprovoked beating that I think if you've been paying attention to the headlines, they have been a target. And so there is also a movement in Israel, another movement of Black Lives Matter, and that is because there is a huge population of Ethiopian Jews, well, they're black, of Ethiopian Jews who are also believed to be one of the lost tribes of Israel. I'm telling you, this story is riveting and the history is quite long. Now, the main challenge in tracing the origins of the Jews' presence in Ethiopia is the lack of reliable accounts. Consequently, there are several versions regarding the origins of the Ethiopian Jews, or as they are historically known, Beta Israel, or translated to mean House of Israel. And one school of thought claims that the Ethiopian Jews are descendants of the lost Hebrew Dan tribe. Remember, Israel, as Jacob, had 12 tribes. So there's one school of thought that says these Ethiopian Jews could be one of the descendants from Dan. And alternative explanations assert that the Beta Israeli community may be the descendants of the entourage that accompanied Menelik I, the son of King Solomon, and Queen Sheba. All right, are you following? Yes, we are going all the way to the Bible. Now, finally, leaders from within the community argue that the Ethiopian Jews are descendants of Jews who left the conquered kingdom of Judah for Egypt following the destruction of the first temple in 586 BC. So these are different thoughts that are trying to perhaps theories, as you may call them in the international relations, that tries to explain how the Ethiopian Jews found themselves in Ethiopia. And for centuries until the 20th century, Ethiopian Jews were completely isolated from the Jewish communities in other parts of the world, yet they adhered to biblical Judaism for many, many centuries. It was Prime Minister Menachem Begin, after he came into power in 1977, who first opened the country to Ethiopian Jews. And it was in response to the threat to the community from famine, political unrest, and the hostility of the self-proclaimed Marxist and Leninist regime led by Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam. Okay, so the Prime Minister Menachem Begin of Israel, and there's a letter that somehow found its way from where they were camping because of the famine and the targeted attacks. I think they had moved to a camp in Sudan, and from this camp, these Ethiopian Jews who were there, somehow one of them got to write to the Israeli Prime Minister at that time, and having received this letter about suffering of some Jews in parts of Sudan and also in Ethiopia, I think after what the Jews had gone through in the Holocaust, the Israeli nation vowed to not let any person who claims to be Jew anywhere in the world to have to suffer again the way they suffered during the Holocaust in Germany. And so somehow a letter got to the Prime Minister that was written in 1978, and from that they devised a way by use of Mossad to try and start to crafting an escape for these Ethiopian Jews who were stuck in Ethiopia and others in the camps in Sudan. So initially, The Israeli Secret Service Mossad organized their immigration through refugee camps in Sudan. Like I've explained there, this resulted in the arrival of about 7,000 Ethiopian Jews in Israel. In later years, Israelis security services embarked on an even more daring operation codenamed Operation Moses in 1984 and in 1985, and Operation Solomon in 1991 that I think rescued a huge number of them. They were sending cargo planes to come and pick them from where they're being picked inside Ethiopia and also in Sudan. They were initially, this Mossad came in not like Israelis, because remember at that time, Israeli and Sudan were not really getting along. Remember what I keep telling you about that agreement that was made in Sudan with the Arab League countries of not recognizing Israel and having not kind of any diplomatic relations with Israel because of the conflict between Israel and Palestine. So this Mossad, who are Israelis, could not come in their true identity, so they had to pretend as if they were white business people from London and other places in Europe for them to be allowed. So they say they're setting up a tourism resort, and they built a wonderful tourism resort in one of the strategic areas where they could be using to smuggle these Jews out of all the way from Ethiopia, for them to find their way in the camps, in refugee camps in Sudan, and for them to be smuggled out of Sudan to Israel. So it was such a tedious but meticulously planned operation by Mossad. And it took some years and meticulousness to plan, but the Sudan government did not know then that these were Israelis, because they were at loggerheads. But then after a while, when they initially started this, the prime minister who was there, the president then, Jeff Mohammed Nimeri of Sudan, I think also Sudan was going through some tough times, and they worked out an agreement, and they said, as long as you do this quietly, after they were discovered that Mossad was discovered that it was carrying out this, helping out these Jewish immigrants, from Sudan, through Sudan to Israel, who were coming from Ethiopia. He said, it will cause a big of a problem with other Arab League countries. So as long as you do this, and of course he asked for a huge amount of money. So as long as you do this, I can, look the other side and let you get all these Jews through Sudan and to Israel, but as long as this operation remains tight-lipped and word does not come out and remains very secretive. So that continued for a while, and because of that, in 1991, they saw the biggest rescue of about 20,000 Jews. With the end of Mengistu regime, it became easier for Jews to immigrate from Ethiopia, and by the end of the 1990s, about 90,000 of the Better Israel community had arrived in Israel. So what are the current causes of the tensions and some of the things that they are experiencing there in Israel? Only 30 years. Now it's over 40 years, but after about 30 years after the arrival of the first Ethiopian Jews to Israel, and following recent violent clashes with the police, there is a broad acknowledgement of the state failed appalling in absorbing the Jewish Ethiopian community. So being motivated by what the Jews went through during the Holocaust, and Israel vowed not to stand still when any Jew was being persecuted around the world. They vowed they will collect all the Jews from across the world, and every Jew, regardless of your background, you'll find your space in Israel. But having migrated all these Ethiopian Jews to Israel, the state had of course they'd built some houses for them, and they were ready for them, but I think they had not thought in the long term at that time, or maybe the successive governments may not have shared the same vision. The prime minister at that time, who orchestrated this migration, the Israeli prime minister at that time, and perhaps the same vision and the same ideology in regards to having these Jews being migrated to Israel. And so the successive leaderships there in Israel has seen different ways by which this Ethiopian Jewish community has been treated there in Israel. And to begin with, there was a lack of empathy in Israeli society for the hardships involved in leaving behind homes. So there are people who actually were separated during that immigration time. There are people who left parts of their family, and there's still that small community still in Ethiopia of the Jewish community that Israel has refused to recognize, and of course has refused for them to immigrate. But they practice Judaism pretty well, and some of their brothers and sisters and uncles and whoever who were lucky to migrate to Israel are still there, and they still have these ties. But Israel has refused to allow them to migrate. Very few cases, people have been able to migrate, but Israel is not really open for that right now. So being there, having arrived there, and having been saved from the hardships that they were going through and the discrimination they were going through, and having found themselves in a new country where they have perhaps the only thing they shared is a religion, but outside of that the cultures were different, the language was different, everything was different, and there was not so much preparation in terms of how they were supposed to adopt. And so there was no empathy from the local Israeli society and see how they can help integrate these refugees from Ethiopia into the Israeli society. And upon their arrival in the Jewish state, they met the inherent Israeli paradox involved in absorbing Jewish immigrants. So they were shocked. They thought, wow, once we've arrived in the promised land, our lives will be better. We will be home. We will be okay. We'll be accepted, because they struggled with the acceptance in Ethiopia. They're not truly accepted and well integrated within the Ethiopian society. So them leaving also and going to Israel, now they have to also struggle with this identity and people who was not ready to accept them, and they couldn't really identify. They can't really identify fully as Israelis, and they can't identify fully as Ethiopians. And I was just watching a documentary over at this smart, some young men who were just trying to raise awareness and there in Israel from this Ethiopian Jewish community, and in how the Israeli police handle, their community, even during arrest, arbitrarily, and things like that. They're not fully accepted. So they were being asked, so who are you? And majority of them would say, I'm Ethiopian first, and then I'm a Jew, and then I am an Israeli. See, that's a problem right there. That's a problem right there, because for me, it's easier for me to say I'm a Kenyan first before I think about my tribe, before I think about anything else. I'm a Kenyan first. So for them, you can see, as much as they were removed from Ethiopia, where they could not fully fit, and taken to a country where they thought this is where they're supposed to be, the Holy Land as they call it, and now here they have to struggle even for more acceptance, and now they're suffering identity crisis. So you can see the Ethiopianness in them still very much alive, and they say, I'm Ethiopian first, and then I'm a Jew second, and then I'm an Israeli third. That order, there lies the problem. So I don't know if some of these problems that they are experiencing in Israel is because of also maybe the attitude they have. Because if you have been in Israel that long, and you want to fully be integrated and be part of that community, but you want to identify as an Israeli on the third point, then that shows that maybe your heart is not there, and maybe your attitude even towards Israel might not be, it's not the same as the Israeli, if you know what I mean. So that also is something there to think about, and that has been a problem. And upon their arrival in the Jewish state, they met the inherent Israeli, like I've said there, that have caused them a lot of untold sufferings. And of course, they were welcomed and granted the basic needs of accommodation, healthcare, education, and general welfare. However, it was done without sensitivity to their specific conditions, and from the outset, these faced discrimination. They faced discrimination and racism from the Israeli establishment. So as much as they were brought in and they were offered the basics, but there has been a lot of inequality, even when it comes to employment and job opportunities. And I was just watching another clip just a few hours ago. One Ethiopian Jew soldier now in Israel, he's a police officer, and he was manning his station. And some Israeli, when I mean the Israeli nationalities, well, they're also Israeli nationalities, but you understand what I'm saying. So the soldiers, the army officials, two of them were passing by where this police was stationed as he manned his station, and they just started beating him up for mere reason that he was black and he was Ethiopian Jews. They just started beating him up. And that is not an isolated incident. These are events that have been recorded. These are experiences that they have to live with. And now that's why a lot of younger Ethiopian Jews in Israel holding these awareness campaigns and saying, hey, Black lives matter, even here in Israel, and we demand to be treated fairly, and also just raise awareness over the inequalities that still exist over 40 years since that immigration that was done there from Ethiopian parts and the refugee camps in Sudan all the way to Israel. And many in the religious establishment even dare to question their Judaism. Yeah, even the main Israeli church, the main is the ultra Orthodox Jews, them, because it's the main church there, and so they are quite they're very specific individuals, if I may say that, okay. And it took them a while even to recognize. And, one of the rabbis, of the chief rabbi of that, who heads that institution, was being questioned why it took so long for them to acknowledge the presence and the contribution and this community as part of them. And yet they practice Judaism to the T, even those who are still in Ethiopia. They practice Judaism to the T. And if you understand how Judaism works and their commitment to reciting Torah and all this, then it requires a commitment, and they are committed to the religion. They are committed to the Judaism way of life. So he was being asked, why has it taken so long before you can recognize this community as being part of your large religious establishment? And he couldn't really give a proper answer. And he was saying, it is probably the right time. Maybe God wanted it to happen at this time, and yada yada yada. Things that I couldn't really understand. Now, one of the early incidents that exposed this approach was the revelation in the 90s that the Israeli National Blood Bank had routinely destroyed blood donated by Ethiopian Israelis for fear of HIV. Now, it sent a message, say there's a national disaster, and there's an appeal for blood donation. And the good Ethiopian Jews, being how wonderful, good Ethiopian Jews, and maybe carrying the African tradition and culture still very vibrant in them of Ubuntu and being a brother's keeper, and there's an appeal for blood. So they would go to these blood banks in droves, and they would go there to donate blood. But after they've donated all this blood, and they've passed the test of it being clean and nothing there to worry about and could be donated to anybody, they will be destroyed. For the fear, even if it had passed all the test, that there's a possibility that it was contaminated with HIV. Okay, but I'm assuming that was in the 90s when HIV was still looked at as, but still, with all the technology and all the advancement that comes from Israel, surely, you would think that they would know better. And having gone through the hard times that they went through during Holocaust and all this, you would think these are people, based on their history, would be more empathetic, would be more considerate, would be more welcoming, would be more loving, and just a bit empathetic. That's all I'm saying. So it was destroyed. Every now and then it was destroyed, and it sent a message of exclusion. They couldn't imagine a blood of a black man maybe running in their bloodstream. I think that is just racism to the core, and it sent a message of exclusion from the rest of the Israeli community and Israeli society, and the failure to absorb the Ethiopian Jews is the failure to fully and genuinely integrate them into the society. And for instance, while Ethiopian Israeli school children comprise only 2% of Israeli pupils, most of them study at schools that are predominantly Ethiopian. They're not fully allowed into the mainstream education system. And maybe because the parents don't feel like the kids are not fit, and maybe, I don't know if there are issues to do with bullying, or it's just the issue of acceptance and I think identity. It boils down to that. And worse still, their attainment in school is much poorer than the general population, which blocks their path to academic success. Many of the Ethiopian Israelis live in the periphery of the society that already grapples with issues of unemployment and scarce public resources. This makes it more difficult for them to integrate and causes friction with the more veteran population. Ethiopian Jews suffer from the highest poverty rate among the Jews in Israel and suffer much higher levels of police stop search, arrest, and incarceration. It was the cycle of discrimination, racism, poverty, hopelessness, and high levels of law breaking that led to the recent clashes that you've seen in the streets of Israel, cities between Ethiopian Israelis and the police. And this challenges Israel to look into the mirror and correct the way it treats a vulnerable segment of the population within its society. So that is just a very brief history and journey of the forgotten Ethiopian Jews and the plight that they have after that daring saving by Mossad. Since after the first letter went to the first not the first prime minister, but the prime minister at the time in 1978, and saying, "We are here, we are suffering, could you help us?" And immediately they crafted a plan to take them there. But their lives still remains. Maybe it's better off compared to how it would have been if they were still in Ethiopia, but still they struggle with acceptance, they struggle with discrimination, and they struggle with some of these biases in the community. And so it is this, this news about these school girls as this school that had taken a trip, and their teachers particularly formed a WhatsApp group and named it Black Students, and they were chatting and making fun of these kids. You wonder why the Ethiopian Jews don't want to take their children to the mainstream schools where it's predominantly the Israelis, because probably they face this kind of bullying. If their teachers are able to do this, and if these kids did not capture it and record it, so apparently they were chatting in this WhatsApp group, and this girl wondered. So she was peeping behind the teachers. Well, bad manners, but I think it was important for her to do that. I don't know why she chose to do that. So while she did that, she found these teachers had created this WhatsApp group, and they had called it the Black School Trip. I'm assuming this school maybe has a sizable number of Ethiopian kids, and so it has been blackenized, or I don't know. So I don't know why they would call it the Black School Trip. Maybe there were too many of them in that group that the teachers perhaps did not want. And so, she filmed the chat over the teacher's shoulder, then shared it on social media, calling the teachers a disgrace. And they were just discussing the students in a way that it was appalling and in a way that it was just embarrassing. So the Ministry of Education came out, and those teachers were sacked and they had to apologize. But this is just a tip of the iceberg on what perhaps some of this community, what this community in particular, the Ethiopian Jewish community, is going through there in Israel. So I don't know if they would sometimes wish to come back to their country in Ethiopia, even as they try to fight for acceptance and their A lot of them are going through identity crisis. And since from what I was watching and what I was seeing, they don't fully identify as Israelis. They identify as Ethiopian first. So I don't know how you can really help that. Do they come back to Ethiopia? Because they really try to maintain their ties, their way of life, their culture there in Israel. There's so much tied back to the motherland. And also, since they're not being fully accepted there, it has become very difficult for them to fully integrate into this Israeli society. That is a crisis. That is a crisis. But hopefully, my hope is by highlighting some of these things and by that girl being able to record what the teachers were saying in that church, maybe just highlight and bring into the fore the attention that such matters require, and maybe the government, because Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, even before these cases were, that time there was a protest between the Ethiopian Jews and, against the police there over the targeted assaults and the targeted arbitrary arrests and things like that. And at that time, Benjamin Netanyahu, he was the prime minister still, he came out and said, there's no place for racism in Israel and everybody had a right and all the Jews will be protected and all that. But since then, nothing much has really changed. So perhaps by highlighting this news story, it will go to point to the government that as much as this rhetoric is there, but nothing much has changed. Things still remain the same, and maybe they need to devise ways and means to ensure that these Ethiopian Jews and others minority groups are able to fully integrate within the fabric of the Israeli community. Okay, I hope you've learned something this afternoon. I want to thank you so much for your time. Hopefully I'll see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. God willing. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye for now.